Right, today guys, I'm going to show you how to cut every tile cut you ever needed to know, giving my professional tips and tricks to make tile cutting easier for you. Let's jump into it. First, the straight cut. Pretty simple one to get started. Get yourself one of these manual tile cutters. It will make your life a lot easier. They scribe and snap your tile, giving you a quick and clean cut. Mark your tile either using a tape or the tile itself. Remember to account for the tile joint. I would always allow a few millimeters under for expansion and play. If the wall is not straight, then you will need 2 marks from each end of the tile. That would be cutting a tile on what we would call the rake when it's not perfectly straight. And you would line your tile up in your cutter to cut through these 2 different marks. So your tile is now ready and marked, then just line it up in your cutter with the middle point. You then just use the cutter's scribe wheel to push through your mark or marks. Now the cutter's braking mechanism will snap the tile once applied. There are various different brands of manual tile cutters with different mechanisms. Smaller, cheaper tile cutters are fine for ceramics like your classic subway tile, but I'd highly recommend a Sigma tile cutter or equivalent for porcelain or larger tiles. I'll link in the description my video about manual tile cutters. So that's a pretty straightforward start. Now let's jump to the L cut. So what we would call the L cut, its name is pretty self-explanatory. You are basically cutting a tile into an L shape. You'll come across these on things like windows, niches, plug sockets, or just generally when your tile is going around things. They are very easy to cut by following the methods I show you here. First I'll show you a plug socket, which is a common L cut. Once you've got your whole tiles placed around it, you can simply mark the sides of the socket, marking the horizontal and vertical as you can see here. You can allow yourself a few millimeters of play here as the faceplate will be bigger than the socket box. And you'll end up with 2 marks like this. Next, scribe the marks on your cutter, then with an angle grinder cut through the shortest line. It's always best to have the left hand side of the blade against the edge you want to be neat, as a common rule. You'll have more control for a nicer cut. Then you're left with something like this. With a small tile you can just use your tile pinchers to remove the piece as you've already scribed it on your cutter. You can also break this piece off on the cutter's breaker if that's easier, which I'll show you next. For this example, I am cutting around the bottom of a niche with a larger tile. I mark the L cut size like with the socket, but using my tape this time, as it's a larger cut and tile. I mark and draw those lines onto my tile, then I can see what I need to remove. Once again, I take the tile to the cutter and scribe through those marks just like this. Now I'm ready to angle grind one of my scribe marks. I'd normally go for the shortest or one that allows me to run the left hand side of the blade down the finished edge. Again, this gives me more control to make sure I don't chip that edge and I have a neat finish. Now that's done, I simply bring the tile back to the cutter and break the other scribe off with the cutter's breaker. This saves me time and ensures that the edge here will be a really nice, neat cut. If you're left with anything in the corner like this, just use the tip of the grinder blade to remove it. Then just finish up with a rub from a rubbing block if necessary. I use a 200 grit diamond block here. And there we go. That's how to cut L cuts quickly and neatly. Next up, the U cut or slot if you like. Funny enough, it's called a U cut because it looks like a U. You can see us tilers are simple beasts. We like to name stuff after alphabet letters. So you'll need these when you need to take a slot out of the end of a tile, maybe for a pipe, shower valve or a plug socket where you need to slide the tile in. Pretty similar method to an L cut. Mark your U that you need to take out with your tape or the tile itself. In this example, it's for the bottom half of a shower valve. Once again, I take my marks using a level clip as a spacer. I transfer them onto the tile and draw the lines so I know what I need to remove. For this one, I'm just going to cut the 3 lines with the angle grinder. You could also scribe it and use pinchers to remove the slot if you wanted to, as we did on the L cut. Like on this one, after just making 2 slots, you can just pinch that out. Because the tile is scribed, it gives a weak point to break out the slot. So pick whatever method suits you in what situation. I'd just always recommend you have a decent porcelain disc for cutting these cuts, and I'll leave some links in the description of what discs I use. Okay, so they are pretty simple cuts. Let's move on to a square in a tile next. This one is where you need to take a square out of somewhere in the tile, not on the edges. So commonly you'd see these for toilet flush plates, shower valves or wall sockets. Again, here the angle grinder with a good porcelain blade is your friend. For these cuts, you'll find yourself even cutting from the back of the tile or starting on the front and finishing it off through the back, just depending on how neat you want the front. If you need the tile face to finish neat with minimal chipping, then I'd always recommend going through the front first, as going from the back can butcher the face of the tile. In this example, I'm taking out the square for this flush plate. I use my level to draw some lines around it, then I can mark from my existing tiles using a level clip as a spacer to the lines to get the measurements for my square. I transfer those marks to the tile and draw the square on the face. If it's it's a small square like a plug socket, I'd recommend transferring those marks to the back of the tile and drawing the box on there. As to get the square out, you will need to overlap your cutting lines, otherwise the grinder blade won't go through far enough to the corners. These won't be visible on the face of the tile if you do this from the back. You'll see what I mean when I cut this one out here. So you just grind along your lines as usual. It's best to go around all the lines a bit first before going fully through to release pressure on the tile so it doesn't break. So you can see here it looks like I've cut the whole box out on the front, but because the blade is round, it actually means there's still a bit of tile left in the corners. So that's where we have to finish from the back and overlap our box marks. And now you can see where the box isn't fully cut out on the back of the tile, like the front. Now I always just take my time a little bit here on these final bits. The trick is to look for daylight through the tile. Once you see the daylight start coming through, then you know not to go any further with your angle grinder. Then just give it a tap with something, and now we have our square cut out. A neat cut with no chipping. Okay, they are some basic shapes. Next, let's move on to some hole cuts. Hole cutting these days has become extremely easy with the right tools, and really is the standard to put holes around pipes and valves instead of squares and slots. Most of the time these things are all covered by larger flanges, but it's good practice to get a nice neat hole if you can. For holes you need some diamond angle grinder hole cutting attachments like these. You can get them in various sizes. They usually cost about £1 or $1 a millimetre. I'd always recommend angle grinder hole cutters over a drill bit, as you have more power and control this way. Two ways I'd recommend marking your hole on your tile is either with a box or a cross. Both ways work fine depending on your situation or preferred method. When I'm doing spotlights I tend to go with a cross, but for pipes I normally stick with a box. So in this example I want to cut a hole in this porcelain tile. I use my tape from my set tiles or lines to mark both sides and top and bottom of the pipe. Then I can make a square on my tile. I draw my measurements on the tile and use my level to join it all up and make a box. I then use the hole cutter that I'm going to use to mark a circle in the box as a guide. I'm cutting this hole bigger than the box, so there is plenty of play as it's all covered, but normally you would want your circle to stay inside the box lines like this, so you end up with a nice neat hole at the correct size. With my hole cutter ready and on my angle grinder, I just go in a little bit first to score the face of the tile. Now I can wet the tile without my marks disappearing and add more water as I need as I go. It's not always essential to wet the tile, but with brittle porcelain tiles it will help the cut and expand your hole cutter's life a little bit longer. So I'm just rocking the hole cutter as I go, trying to not keep it in just one direction. This will keep it cooler and help the cut. The piece will fly out of the bottom at some speed. So if it's a big hole like this, I'd recommend a bucket underneath the cut, so it spins out into the bucket instead of at a window or a car. With smaller holes though, it's not so much of a problem as the piece won't come out as vicious. Okay, that's how you do standard holes. Now let's show you a bigger hole. So for big holes like toilet soil pipes or air vents, you can get extremely large core drill bits, but they can be expensive and are a bit hardcore for tiling. So I'd recommend my simple method here to save cost and time. First I would mark some level lines around the hole to mark to. Then with my tape, measure to them from my set tiles or lines. I transfer their marks to the tile and connect them to make a square box. Depending on how covered the hole is, I would tend to make my square about 5mm larger than the original hole, just for a bit of play. Now I know that my top, bottom and sides of the hole roughly touch the sides, top and bottom of my square, so this is my guide. Then with something similar in size that is round, I would use a grinder disc, a roll of tape or a round tub, or even better if you've got some offcut of some pipe like I've got here. I place it in my square and start drawing a circle around it, knowing that all the sides will hit my box lines, and that gives me the circle that I need to cut out. Using the angle grinder with a porcelain disc, I just start rotating it around the circle. You don't need to go mega deep here, you're basically just creating a scribe like on the tile cutter. Now this time, actually going through the tile, I start making a cross inside the circle, then do some diagonals, then a square. Now bits of the tile will start falling away and I'll be left with a rough hole in the middle. This will allow me to get my tile pinchers into the hole and start breaking off what's left. As I've scribed around the circle, the bit should snap off to that scribe line. Anything that doesn't come off easy, you can just go back over it again with the angle grinder to weaken it. And that's it. You could then just neaten it up with the grinder or a cone attachment if required. You shouldn't need to be too neat here, as most of these holes should be well covered. But if you want to, then use the methods above until you are happy. Next, a half circle, a nice easy one. For a half circle, same as with the big hole, I use my level to draw some lines around this shower valve in this example. Then I can take some marks with my tape and transfer them onto the tile. I then just connect them up to make a U shape. I find something that is round, about the same size, in this case a roll of tape, then draw around it, keeping within my lines. Then I use the grinder to lightly score around the shape. I just make sure I cut through both ends a bit, as these are weak points when pinching. I then just cut a few slots to my scored half circle. Then I can simply pinch out the bits to remove them. Again, as the shape is scored, they will snap out to that point. Then I just run the side of the grinder blade around the shape to neaten it up. Again, you could also use a cone attachment or a hole cutter here, whichever you prefer. And there we go, that's a pretty easy one. Okay, so those are some tile shapes. Now I'll show you a mitre. Tile mitres are commonly used to finish edges when you're not using tile trim or have angled walls. If you have a big water cutter that turns 45 degrees, then that's great, and it's pretty self-explanatory. Today I'm going to show you how to do them with an angle grinder. First up, I'd recommend putting a mark on your tile so you know which way your mitre is going. I just roughly gauge it. I don't normally go exactly 45 degrees. I probably take more of an angle off, if anything. The trick is when mitering tiles is to leave about 2mm on the edge. This is because it will chip and be very weak if you try to go to nothing with the grinder, and there's nothing worse than spending a lot of time cutting for a bit to chip off right at the end. So you'll see here I just roughly go down the tile, keeping 2mm from the edge. I'm just trying to take some of the tile out the back first. I'm not aiming for the 45 degrees at the start or it to be perfectly neat. I'm just really trying to make a line and take a bit out of the back of the tile at a lower angle, like 20 degrees. This releases the pressure on my blade, giving it more freedom to perform the 45 degree cut better in the next run through. Now I have better control to rotate my blade on this run through. I concentrate on making my 2mm edge nice and straight and taking the 45 degree angle out of the tile. Sometimes it can take a few runs through, but with a decent blade, a couple of runs should be enough, even with a porcelain tile like this. And there we go. And you can see here from my example, this one sits in nicely to this angled wall. Okay, while we're on 45 degrees, I'll show you how to do a diamond or envelope cut. You'll come across envelope cuts mostly on wet room shower trays when you need to cut the tiles to the pre-made falls in the tray, creating an envelope. There's a few methods here. You can use a water cutter to run through the tile if you have one. This would give you a pretty neat finish and is good for natural stone tiles. If you don't have one of them, you can use an angle grinder like I'm doing here. I would tend to score through my line with the angle grinder first. Then with either end of the tile, I'd recommend just going in with your angle grinder about 1 centimetre before going any further. This will help stop the tile ends from chipping or breaking off. Then you can run through your cut as normal. You actually most of the time can just run through halfway and break it in your hands, then just neaten it up with the grinder. For me personally, the way I like to cut them usually is with the manual tile cutter. If you have a good tile cutter with a push down mechanism like the Sigma here, they are pretty easy to do and will be the best finish out of the three, plus obviously being a lot quicker. As easy as this. And there we go, guys. They are some of the most common cuts used in tiling, so I hope you picked up some tips there, guys, on how I go about things. If you want to see some envelope cuts in action, then feel free to watch my wet room floor guide video right here. Take care, and I'll catch you in the next one.